Welcome to the Metabolic Link, a podcast that explores the common thread of metabolism in health and disease. This is where science meets society. Welcome to the Metabolic Link. I'm your host, Dominic D'Agostino. Today, I am thrilled to have Todd Wagner on the show. Todd is a serial entrepreneur. He's known for introducing streaming media as co-founder and CEO of Broadcast.com, which he sold to Yahoo for $5.7 billion. He then founded the Todd Wagner Foundation to provide technology programs for at-risk children and launched the Charity Network, helping thousands of charities raise millions through digital fundraising. As CEO of 2929 Entertainment, he has produced over 50 films and continues to invest in innovative brands. So today we're diving into his latest project called FoodFight USA. It's a nationwide campaign with a mission to clean up America's tainted food supply and empower consumers by raising awareness about the dangers of ultra-processed food. We refer to these as UPFs. Through this initiative, Todd aims to get state and federal legislation passed to end self-regulation by food companies. He also seeks to work with American farmers to grow healthier foods that benefit both economic stability and also the consumer health. I hope you enjoy this episode of Todd's incredible journey and his vision for a healthier future with FoodFight USA. But before we begin, I want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. They make this kind of content possible for you guys, and we really appreciate you guys listening to the ads of this episode and visiting our partners' websites. You won't hear about a product on this podcast unless we believe in it, unless we're actually using it ourselves, right? So in this episode is brought to you by Genova Connect. If you're listening to this podcast, it's likely that you want to take your metabolic health to the next level. And I like to have as much data as possible when trying to achieve my health goals. Otherwise, I'm just shooting in the dark when it comes to following the optimal diet or supplements that I need or don't need. Genova Connect takes the guesswork out. They provide a variety of diagnostic tests, including comprehensive metabolic panels. They have a hormone panel, food sensitivity. They have a gut sensitivity test. All this is designed to optimize your unique health goals. With this information, you can make informed decisions that empower you along your journey versus just spinning your wheels. What's more, Genova Connect allows you to dig into your health in the comfort of your own home. So they mail you the kit and then you put the sample. It could be urine, blood, saliva, and you mail it back to them directly. These tests have guided me on supplements that I need and number of supplements that I don't need. For example, like omega-3 levels are off the charts, right? Because I eat a ton of sardines. So unless I stop eating sardines, I probably don't need that supplement. I didn't really realize it until, doing the Genova tests, and that has really helped me dial in my nutrition and my supplementation. Genova Connect is offering you a 15% off any of their test kits when you use the code Metabolic Link at gdx.net/the Metabolic Link. That's Metabolic Link at gdx.net/the Metabolic Link. Now, on to our podcast. Todd, it is great to see you again and great to have you here on the Metabolic Link podcast. And we've been talking about this subject of ultra-processed foods for some time. And before I begin, I just want to read a quote from your founder's speech on the FoodFight USA website. I listened to that speech 3 times and I have a couple pages of notes. And I've encouraged people to go to FoodFight USA website. But you gave the quote, "Good food is medicine and bad food requires medicine." So, and I think the theme of today's podcast is going to be more or less kind of, discussing this idea of good medicine or good food and bad food and what that means, especially in the case as it pertains in the US to ultra processed foods. So maybe give the listeners and maybe a little bit of a background. I connected with you, with your wife, Carrie had reached out and you were doing education outreach, even with Carrollwood Day School, I think at your house. And I had given some lectures, I believe, on nutrition, maybe neuroscience and some science, some space science stuff. And I was really inspired by that. And then come to find out, you had the Charity Network and we're doing so many things that I didn't even know about until I started digging. So, and we'll get into what FoodFight USA is, but maybe tell our listeners here how you got started.
Yeah, I mean, good or bad, my background has nothing to do with the food industry and what I'm doing now, which in some ways is the beauty of it, that all of us as, concerned citizens can get up to speed and to learn a topic if we care about it. And I think ultra processed foods is probably the number one health issue in this country right now. And so I'm happy almost in the fact that I don't come from this industry. I actually bring a different perspective. So my background, as some may know, I practiced law for 7 years. I was CEO of a company called Broadcast.com with Mark Cuban. We were the first to stream media in the whole world. Sold our business. We went public, had the largest one-day gain in the history of Wall Street at the time, and sold to Yahoo for $5.7 billion back in 2000. And then after that, I started my own private foundation for at-risk youth, worked very closely with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, After School All-Stars, which is Governor Schwarzenegger's organization. KIPP charter schools, helped bring a KIPP charter school to Dallas. They're now all over the country, and worked closely with the First Tee. And then after getting all of that off the ground, and I still have those today, I went into the entertainment industry, which is helpful for what I do now, because by doing that, I obviously have met a whole bunch of folks through the years that are well known. So Mark and I kind of went back in partnership together and bought the Landmark Theater chain, which we subsequently sold a few years ago, launched Magnolia Pictures, through which we've distributed probably 400 movies, including Food Inc. 2, very recently. We have a theatrical production company called 2929 Productions, through which we have made probably 40 of our own movies, some good, some really bad. Everything from Good Night and Good Luck with George Clooney to We Own the Night. And so I've been very heavy in the entertainment industry for a long time. And I think the important thing to me at this point in my life is that everybody knows where I'm from. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. I grew up in a steel mill town. I grew up in a very, very blue collar place, as had my dad and his dad before him. And so I came from a part of the country that sometimes is neglected and sometimes not thought about, and sometimes, as we get into this food topic, is kind of left behind. And so I still have a very warm place in my heart for where I'm from and where I began. And I try to never forget that if I can be a voice for others in this regard, that's something I want to do. And as you may know, I don't do a lot of media these days. My business partner does. Mark does a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't. But for this topic, I care so deeply that people better understand something that I think is just absolutely crazy what's going on in this country, that I'm, ready, willing, and able to talk to anyone about it.
I appreciate you stepping out because this topic is near and dear to my heart. As a faculty leader in the nutrition program at the medical school, I think this should be priority number one: ultra processed foods, targeting them, what's in them. Sugar is a main driver for energy toxicity, of course, but the whole list of chemicals too that I was even unaware of as someone who's supposed to be an expert in this field of all the different chemicals that were in the food. And I think you had talked about a story in your founder speech you're at George Clooney's house, I believe, in Lake Como. And we were just there. Actually, I had pizza in Lake Como and in Sardinia too. And I went way off my diet, but didn't have any adverse effects that I typically have. And I think in that conversation that you had with him, that I think the conversation was that you could eat, pizza and pasta and things that you have in the US and not gain weight. And, anecdotally, that rang true to you. And I think maybe that planted a seed for you to maybe investigate this, and maybe a little bit of the backstory with George Clooney, because I think I'm a fan of his and just was curious about that.
Yeah, I think it's actually important only in the sense of, to me, the most important part of this story is why it's so different in Europe versus the United States. And for the average American, I don't think we know how much different the food supply is in Europe versus the United States. So in Europe, there is a very different approval system. There is one food agency, the European Food Safety Agency, and they regulate food from the farm to the table. It is very hands-on. It is very proactive. It is very, for lack of a better word, guilty until proven innocent, meaning if you're going to put a novel chemical synthetic into the food supply, you have to show that it's safe. So they require independent testing by scientists. They require cumulative effects testing. They require pre-market testing. And if it's shown to be a carcinogen in those tests, it will be banned. And, now as we sit here today, and obviously we'll have plenty of time to talk about the United States, but there are probably 10,000 or so. And to me, the exact isn't as important as the direction of it. 10,000 synthetic food chemicals in our food supply in the United States. And there's only about 300 or 400 approved in Europe. So it turns out that, yes, that statement, that wonderful conversation with Mr. Clooney to talk about the fact that, pizza and pasta doesn't cause him or others to gain weight, turns out to be true. There's a reason. It's because there's fewer chemicals in that food supply. The wheat is grown differently over there. It might not be sprayed with glyphosate like it is in the United States. And so many, many Americans, and I know you know this to be true, that are gluten intolerant in America can go over to Italy and all of a sudden they're eating pasta and pizza and they're like, this is amazing. And that to me is the reason for George's story. Yeah, that was many years ago, and it didn't ring true to me. I didn't even understand it at that point. You're always like, well, maybe it's because I'm on vacation. Maybe it's different. And then you start, if anybody Googles European vacation and coming back, for those of us who have been lucky enough to go to Europe, you will see this is not an uncommon theme that people go and come back and they haven't gained weight or they felt better or their joints didn't hurt as much. And it's because our body can't process a lot of these chemicals. They weren't meant to be in our system, in our body. It subverts our metabolism and it creates all sorts of issues. And so that to me is the interesting part of the George Clooney story. It's certainly a hook and makes people look at it. But the reality is it made me think about it. And then what really drove it forward was I had been a small investor in a documentary called The C Word. And that was a documentary that Laurie McCreary, a good friend of mine and partner in crime in this with me, a producer in Hollywood, did. And Morgan Freeman is her producing partner. And so he did the voiceover. And it talked some about processed foods, but it also talked about how the cigarette industry, after they had settled in the 1980s with the government, went and bought food companies. And in the 1980s, they went and bought Kraft and Nabisco and General Foods, and the light bulb went on of, wow, what happened here? And then, obviously, they started figuring out a way to make the foods more addictive. Obviously, the word they used was hyperpalatable, but we all know what the word is. It's addictive.
Yep.
And they wanted to do that on purpose to drive sales. And then they needed a way to, as you know, make the goods cost less, stay longer in the supermarket. And so they started using loopholes called GRAS that I know you know incredibly well in order to accomplish that. And we'll talk about it. But what I think is interesting is in Europe, for example, bread spoils in 3 days. In the States, it's 30 days. In Europe, fruits and vegetables go out of season. In the States, they don't go out of season. I know NBA European players who tell me that when it's the off season and they go back home to Europe, they feel better than when they are in the States during the season. It's McDonald's fries have 10 or 12 ingredients in the States and they have 3 in Europe. It's understanding that it is different over there. There is a different way to do it. And what frustrates me, and the reason I've become so vocal about this, is because the food companies are changing the ingredients now for Kit Kat bars or candy bars. Because again, none of what we are fighting for is to ban anything. It's to merely reformulate ingredients to be safer and healthier and less toxic for Americans so that they're not slowly poisoned. So and then we can start our conversation on GRAS.
Yeah. And well, the health I mean, you said, ultra processed foods are kind of like the new cigarettes. And there is a specific problem in the United States where, I think maybe it's 2 to 3 times more prevalent, these metabolic diseases of obesity, of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it is in many ways a US centric kind of, and that hence the, Food Fight USA is that the problem really is with a regulatory system in the USA. And yeah, we had talked before about generally recognized as safe or grass, and having served on grass panels before earlier in my career, I know these things are a very low bar for getting things approved. And then some companies could self-affirm grass. And then there's like, it gets like in just based upon, oh, there's a similar ingredient that's already in the food, line since 1958 or something like that. So a lot of things just get like grandfathered in, or just a lot of hand waving is done and these things get passed through. So, and I know a big focus of what you're doing is federal legislation to amend the grass, and maybe tell
So,
people about that.
yeah, so people know. So grass is a lot of legislation, had no evil intent. It was in 1958 to make it so that certain things like baking soda and vinegar that they knew to be safe were safe and didn't require an FDA approval process because they'd kind of already been out there. But when those food companies were purchased by tobacco, by big tobacco, they used that loophole in a way that it was never intended, and used it to put in chemicals like red dye 3 or potassium bromate or a litany of 10,000 chemicals. And what they would do is hire their own scientists. They would then say, we believe it to be safe. They would do no cumulative effects testing. They would do no pre-market testing. They would say, oh, well, this small amount is okay. Well, a small amount of almost anything is okay. The way things, you and I could have 5 cigarettes today. We're not going to die from it. But
Mhm.
what happens is when you have these chemicals and these dyes every day across 5 different foods for a number of months and years, then that's when the metabolic syndrome consequences come, the inflammation comes, that in young people can be ADHD. It could eventually become, type 2 diabetes. As we age, that can turn into high blood pressure, that can turn into obesity. And we all know that obesity is a big driver of other disease. And so when we say to people, our big mantra, it's not you, it's the food. What big food has done is made people think it's their lack of willpower, or they just need to go to the gym more. And I tell people all the time, I'd love for a CEO of a food company to have 80% of their calories be UPFs. Let's see how they feel. Let's see what their blood work feels like. Let's see how much they want to exercise. And so this is one of those situations where if you are in certain parts of the country and your choices are limited or your ability to get it is limited, we have to fight to get better ingredients, not to ban anything, to get better ingredients for people so that when they go to the grocery store, they are making choices without having to make them because a lot of these toxic chemicals are removed. So what's happened over the last 20 years is that you alluded to it earlier. They've almost completely self-regulated and put in these chemicals because they have said it's safe. If the FDA even reviews it, they have the legal right to pull it and then put it in anyway. It's estimated there's somewhere between 1 and 2,000 of those chemicals that we don't even know the names of them because they hide in words like natural flavorings and
Yep.
additional sweeteners and things like that. So we not only don't know which ones are the worst offenders, although we have a pretty good idea of some of the worst because we can look over at Europe and other countries, but we don't even know about some of them if they're good or bad because we don't even know what they are. That's how messed up it is.
I am so excited to share with you an incredible scientific breakthrough to support and optimize your metabolic health. C15 is the first essential fatty acid to be discovered in 90 years. And get this, studies have confirmed that its biological effects are 3 times more potent and more broad with less side effects, for example, than omega-3 fatty acids. So, and what's really interesting, without even realizing it, most people are deficient in C15, which significantly decreases our energy levels and our resilience. This all makes us age faster. It contributes to poor sleep, feeling exhausted. Does it sound familiar? So many people report this. Fatty 15 is a science-backed, award-winning, vegan-friendly, pure C15 supplement. And as an essential nutrient, fatty 15 effectively repairs our cells and can restore our long-term health. I personally found that my C15 levels are actually within the good normal range, but I expected them to be kind of off the charts because I eat a huge amount of C15 containing foods, grass-fed beef, fatty fish, and dairy, sour cream, for example. So, but I expected them to be off the charts like omega-3s, but not surprisingly, I've been getting, since we did a podcast on this topic, people have emailed me and others have told me that they are deficient in C15 and they're eating a relatively good diet. So they would not know this unless they use Genova testing to show them that they have a clear deficiency. So C15 levels are intimately tied to longevity, health, and metabolic function, mitochondrial function. So you can get an additional 15% off their 90-day supply subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/metabolic link and using the code metabolic link at checkout. Back to our podcast.
So when I first got involved in this, I went to visit Governor Schwarzenegger, who is a longtime friend, and he was involved and is involved in climate change over in Austria. He does a European World Summit there every year. And he said that he would help. He said it in his voice, not mine. And I came over and met with the folks at the Schwarzenegger Institute. And we found out there was a piece of legislation in California, and this is last summer, that was kind of stuck. And I was put in touch with the Assemblyman, Jesse Gabriel, who's a superstar. And I said, what's going on? And he said, Todd, we need it to be bipartisan, which, by the way, is how I feel about this entire issue. This cannot be partisan. This is not Republican or Democrat. This is a health issue. And I say it to anyone and everyone. We have as many clips on our Food Fight USA site from Fox News as we do from NBC or CNN. Why? Because everybody sees this almost identically. In fact, it's kind of funny now. The only ones that seem to see it differently are people that are from the food industry or from a trade association in the food industry or on the payroll of the food industry and have lost, obviously, the ability to be objective in doing it. So anyway, so we got involved. We got Governor Schwarzenegger to publicly endorse the bill. It became known as the California Food Safety Act. And then I went and met with Governor Newsom and spoke with him about it for an hour, in that it was such an important first step. We ended up banning 4 chemicals that are being removed from the food supply in California by 2027, things like potassium bromate and red dye 3. And it was a bellwether that things were going to be different. So since that legislation got signed into law last October, there's now 10 or 11 states with similar legislation, some adding other chemicals, some focusing on food dyes, some doing it differently, some even kind of taking grass into their own hands. And that's great, because that sends the message that people are upset. And in fact, on our website, we have an interactive map for people to click on their home state and find out, is there any legislation in my state? And if not, an ability to reach out to their congressman or senator directly to find out, why isn't this happening? Why do you not care about our health? So anyway, so we got that signed. And in fact, now they're back for round 2, trying to pass the California School Food Safety Act this fall to try to ban some of the dyes into the school food system. And that's being looked at now. So anyway, so we got that passed. And I basically pivoted over to the federal side, which, as we all know, is incredibly complicated and difficult. So the first leg of Food Fight is the legislative side. So we are indeed trying to amend GRASS, but it's complicated because there has been proposals through the years to do so, drafted by congressmen and other folks, but it's never really gotten anywhere. And so it's got to be framed properly. There's got to be enough people that care about it. It has to be illustrated why it's important, but it's ongoing. And it's complicated because it's not just amending it so it can't happen anymore. We've got 10,000 chemicals. I always call it like, we've got all the cows out in the field. We don't know what those chemicals are doing. So we need a way to review the existing ones as well, and then hopefully close it on the go forward. The other thing we are pushing hard for is front of package warning labels. So that is basically a take on what happened in the cigarette industry, of course, where they put warnings on there. Nicotine's addictive, can be hazardous to your health. And the same thing applies here. We want, make the choice you want, but we want you to be informed that this product is basically an ultra processed food. It's high in salt, it's high in sugar, it's high in fat. And this, by the way, not a novel concept, except in America. So in South America, it's all over the continent.
Yeah.
And they do it with black octagons to indicate if something's high in salt, fat, or sugar. And if you get one of those, you can't advertise to children anymore your product, your cereal, or your other things, because you're not healthy for children. So whether it's that, or there's red, yellow, green lights in Europe, these things are happening. That's the crazy part that I want people to know. It's happening all over the world, except here.
Yeah.
We always pride ourselves as the beacon of the world. And in this case, we are really behind because of the fact that a few very small number of companies have basically dictated the agenda in this country for the last 40 years. And now we show up with a country that's 75% overweight or obese now. That is an unbelievable statistic for all the things that I know you care about, with metabolic syndrome issues and inflammation issues and all that means. And again, we tell people it's not you, it's the food.
I think many people would agree with you, and there's just a paucity of research on these chemicals, and they somehow make it into the food system with little, without the expert oversight that there should be. And there's investigators that look at ultra processed food, like Kevin Hall, and in the world of research on nutrition, ultra processed food is kind of like, thought to be like code speak for hyperpalatability, which is high sugar or high fat or high salt. But we don't give enough attention to these chemicals, and I think that these chemicals become synergistically toxic in the context of metabolic derangement, which is, hyperglycemia. If someone has type 2 diabetes or someone has inflammation, then these chemicals enter their bodies, then they have less capability of detoxification. So there's like first pass metabolism and certain pathways that the liver kind of goes through to detoxify. And, about half of the population has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is essentially impaired liver metabolism, hence detoxification, things like that. So it's a grossly overlooked area of research. And I think that research really needs more funding, but I guess there's a problem with industry. Who's going to fund this? Is the NIH going to step up and fund the various chemicals? And maybe you can make a short list of the top 10. There is funding allocated for ultra processed food, but and sugar is probably a main driver, but there's just a paucity of research on these chemicals. So how do you think the legislation can change federal funding to do the peer-reviewed research that's necessary to get some of these chemicals out? Or it's just, if we can just adopt the European system?
Look, there are just a stunning number of studies out there already. And
Existing.
I steer clear of the science because I'm not a doctor and I'm not a scientist. I do speak to a fair number of them, from, Dr. Sanjay Gupta to Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, who wrote Ultra Processed People, to Dr. Mark Hyman, who wrote Food Fix. So I am exposed to what is going on. And I will say this, that, the cigarette industry with cigarettes, there was never a double-blind study. How could you do a double-blind study with cigarettes and have somebody smoke 3 packs a day and somebody not smoke at all, and let's see how that goes? It's just that there's, you've seen the studies. There was one huge meta study with millions of people showing that UPFs were causing 20 different, associated diseases with it. I would argue that the evidence is there. We now need the will to fight. And what I would say to people that that may not be familiar with the term ultra-processed food, let me just tell you what ultra-processed ingredients are. And I'm going to rattle these off quickly, not for anybody to write them down, but just to know. Things like flavors, flavor enhancers, colors, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, thickeners, humectants, stabilizers, preservatives, antioxidants, anti-foaming agents, gelling agents, glazing agents, bleaching agents, gums, lecithins. All of these things are put into someone's food. And we don't even call them internally ultra-processed foods, although that's the word. We call them addictive edible substances because it's really not food. These are chemicals. There's no food. There's no eggs in there. There's no milk in there. These are synthetic chemicals that have been put into the food supply.
50 to 75% of American adults are deficient in magnesium. And I was surprised to find out that I was one of them. So only after testing did I actually see that I was on the low end of normal, unless I supplement with magnesium. So I've seen this to actually be a feature. Low magnesium is a feature of people on ketogenic diets, people on carnivore diets. Surprisingly, superfoods like steak, eggs, and even liver are really low in magnesium. So if you're on these kind of diets, you might want to check your magnesium. Super important. Again, that could be with a Genova test, or just start off right at the bat. You start using a magnesium supplement. Mellow Magnesium is a super blend that contains 3 of the most bioavailable, nutrient-dense forms of chelated magnesium on Earth, combined with GABA and also L-theanine. So I take this supplement for energy and relaxation and focus during the day. And I even take the supplement. I'd love to take the supplement as a pre-workout. So magnesium, clear evidence that magnesium can enhance exercise performance. It can enhance recovery. Magnesium significantly can reduce muscle soreness after a workout and the days following delayed onset muscle soreness. So become the best version of yourself and get 15% off NED products with the code Metabolic Link. So go to helloned.com/Metabolic Link and enter the code Metabolic Link at checkout. That's HELLONED.com/Metabolic Link to get 15% off.
I always try to flip it and think about, let's talk about the FDA for a minute and about how things are handled. If I am looking at the FDA and how they have traditionally looked at food, there has been a very little concern paid to the food supply. There's been a lot of concern with new drugs and medical devices and vaccinations, depending on where we are. But the food part, it even resides in a different place in DC than the drug part of the FDA. Has frankly, been treated as if it was the orphan, the odd person out in the attention that it's gotten. And then that goes back to something you and I have spoken to off camera, which is medical doctors typically don't have nutrition or dietitian or those kinds of backgrounds. So It makes perfect sense that the food part isn't as interesting to them because that's not how they were trained. They were trained more often to diagnose, prescribe a medicine, and then move on from there, as opposed to what we talked about at the top of the show, that good food can be medicine. Mm-hmm. And the irony, and I've seen this quote a couple of times and I really like it, is that, the health industry does what it does without any regard to food, and the food industry does what it does without any regard to our health. And so they're at odds with each other because they aren't worried about the impact of it. And so these ingredients, just so folks know that I rattled off, they come together basically in these processing plants, and eventually they add all these ingredients and it turns into these ultra processed foods that reside on your shelf. But they're they're individual food, right? So it's palm oil from Asia, or it's cocoa from Africa, it's soy from South America, it's wheat from the United States. It's these real foods that then get put into this cocktail, and all of a sudden it's turned into something else. And I think that's the super important part of this, is that we have been guinea pigs in this country for the last 50 years of what putting all these chemicals into our food supply would do to people. And I think the verdict is in. And so when it's like the science, there is, as you know this space, there are literally hundreds of articles now that cite it, and almost unanimously, as I said, except for the people that are on the other side of the argument, the food industry, who has the most to lose. But I always view it as, why wouldn't they just embrace this and get in front of it? Because they've shown that it can be done. They're doing it in Europe. They're doing it in Canada. They're doing it in parts of South America, even in Mexico with warning labels. But yet they refuse to do it here, and will fight. And that's when it's that old, history lesson. The cigarette industry knew in the 20s and 30s that cigarette was bad to your health. And it wasn't until 1967 when the Surgeon General said that smoking can be harmful. I mean, these are long battles. These are long wars. These are long games that we have to fight. And, it wasn't until 1971, I think it is, that advertising got banned for cigarettes, in 1998 when the Master Settlement Agreement came out. So the battle begins, and they will take the position of obfuscation, of confusion, of paying for studies. But in many cases, these studies, they put in the contract that if the results are not what we want, they can just terminate it.
Yep. So common. And really, I mean, with cigarettes, it's, the young adults, although I think even my parents, or my mom started smoking at like 13, 14 or something like that, quite a long time ago. But the kids are really, the target population for these ultra processed food, sadly, are the kids with the advertising. So they're hijacking their physiology, their neurobiology, and their the addictive potential of these hyperpalatable foods. And it gets them, and I grew up eating Fruit Loops and everything, and somehow, I escaped, but then I sort of got interested in food in early high school. And I think I kind of weaned myself off of it. But I think, and a big part of your philanthropy is really just focusing on children and outreach education, in the younger populations. And I think that's kind of like the low hanging fruit. And I know like the first prong that you have is like federal legislation for grass, and then consumer grassroots, where it starts with education. And I think you said anger, and then question. Like it's education, and then you have to get people angry, and then you have to get them to question and I think so it's got to come from the bottom up. I mean, you got top down, bottom up, and then, academia, which is maybe somewhere in the middle. But maybe talk about that consumer grassroots movement through your website.
So that first stool, the first leg of the stool, the legislative side, the federal stuff that we've talked about, and frankly, whether at some point there should be our own food agency in the States. Do you take the F out of the FDA? Those are all long-term discussions. Those are the long game. And we know full well that will only roll as fast as it decides to roll, and it's complicated. But the other two legs of our stool are things we can control. So the second one is this grassroots leg that you described. So we launched FoodFightUSAcom back in April to start making people aware of this issue. And I'm proud of this website. I mean, it's got a lot of information. People can do a very deep dive on this topic if they want, or they can just stay with some of the highlights of what they want. So we've got videos on there. There's lots of categories, ways for them to be involved, to be a food fight warrior, to click on the interactive map. There's tons of articles that talk about what we just alluded to a few minutes ago, like where's the science? And we talk about the science and where it's at, and the books and the things that have already been written in this space. And we go through all of that so that somebody can learn a little or as much as they want, and begin that process, as you alluded to, of getting outraged, of getting angry, of getting a little pissed off. Like, why is this happening in this country? So the US is the leader in new drugs. So if you are bringing a new drug to market, the United States is the most restrictive. Efficacy, safety, all the data, all the phases that folks have to go through with a lot of FDA input. In fact, it's less restrictive in countries around the world. So sometimes companies will go to the Singapore or UK to get something approved. But then when it comes to food, we flipped it the other way. And so the biggest thing we try to do on the website and elsewhere is just inform people. That's it. They will make their own decisions about what that means. But we want them to know that it's different everywhere else, that we are not asking for things that has not been done before by the food companies because they're currently doing it in 27 countries throughout the EU, for example. And we want them to know that the ingredients on the side of the box of cereal and other things that they think has been approved by a government agency has not been through this grass loophole and other things that have happened. So we do that to let people know and to educate them, like, why do we have the FDA and the USDA and the EPA, and they all interact and overlap in some ways in our food supply, making it incredibly inefficient, incredibly hard to know. A lot of people I'm sure know, right? The USDA handles the organic things and all of that oversight, but there's overlap within these categories of how things are approved and how they're rolled over. So yes, phase 2, leg 2 is the site, social media, getting celebrities involved, getting influencers involved, just getting the word out so that people are aware, and then letting that go. And we will do the same thing on the entertainment industry side and try to get things into movies, into scripts, into shows, so that people can understand there is a very real problem in this country, but we know it will take a beat, just like the cigarette industry. This is not going to happen in a month or a year or even a few. But we have to start. And so that's the second leg. Then the third leg is what I call, the solution side, because one of my big sayings is one of Teddy Roosevelt's sayings that if you just, spot a problem and don't offer a solution, it just makes you a whiner. So we are trying to give people solutions today, things that they can do now to make their life a little better. So if you go to our site right now, there are links to places where you can buy cleaner foods. In some cases, even products directly from Europe. In some cases, things that are even Demeter certified, which is kind of the gold standard of organic certification in Europe. And that may be a topic, that we talk to at some level here later on. But it refers to the fact that then it's regenerative farming has been a part of it. Carbon sequestration has been a part of it, humane to animals, good for the environment, and clean, non-toxic chemicals. So we want to point people to places where they can buy healthier foods right now, websites, places. Obviously, we point people to the Yuka app. We point people to the Environmental Working Group app so that people can start scanning those labels on the side that none of us besides you can pronounce the ingredients and be able to understand what it is that's in there and understand maybe I want to pick something else. And those apps aren't perfect, but they are a big step in the right direction in that it starts to change habits. So Yuka is a really interesting example because it was started in France. And it took off so much in France that 1 out of 3 people in the country downloaded the app. Why is that important? Well, it modified people's behaviors. They were not buying as much of the ultra-processed, kind of bad for you food. So the manufacturers changed their ingredients in order to rate higher on their app. Well, that's a beautiful example, as you and I have talked about, of that grassroots, bottoms up, people being able to effectuate change in their country. And now Yuka's obviously in the States. The legislation is clearly the top-down stuff, and you try to meet in the middle. But if you shove in both directions and people become more involved in that process, like we'll start partnering with youth organizations and just continuing, again, awareness, because we all know we're all busy people. The first time somebody hears it, they're like, yeah. And maybe though by the 10th time, then they'll read something about it or look at it more deeply or think about it. So that is the third leg, is our solution side, and I can go into some depth on the different things we do there.
Well, I want to just like the app, the Yuka app, and I know there's other like, apps maybe you might be developing and it's sort of it's evolving in its use. Like I was in Walmart and I scanned olives or something like that, like something that was a healthy food. And one olive, brand, which was a common brand, gave me like 20. So it gave it a very poor score. And in another, it was something like 60. And I was like, what's the difference? So I went into the app and then it had like learn more, and then it had the PubMed links to about three or four different chemicals that I did not know were actually in that brand of like olives. And it made me instantly, just by scanning the barcode and informed consumer, that I had the option, and I think they were both about the same price, to choose the option that eliminated those chemicals. And it was just much, and actually there was some science in those chemicals that I didn't know. One or two I was familiar with, like sodium benzoate, but two others I was not familiar with, and I had been eating this brand for quite some time. So I think that level of like transparency that the app could bring, and then the education and just questioning, is like so important from the consumer side, because otherwise I would not know. I didn't have any kind of warning on the front side of the container, and so we have to like it's up to us. The government's not gonna save us, and why those chemicals are in there, I don't know. Why one brand cannot use them and be perfectly fine and taste equally or better. So,
And for us to know that food companies will on purpose try to make it hard to figure out, right?
yeah,
That's with serving sizes and portion sizes, and
for
even
sure.
I
Yeah.
think it was Mexico where they had the black octagon, and then the food company made the identical box on the backside so they could put that on the front, so it wouldn't have
Yep.
the black octagon that was meant to be there to warn people. And
Yep.
so we have to know that there will always be attempts to get around or circumvent what is
Yep.
going on. So, our mission statement is three things, right? Get state and federal legislation passed to stop self-regulation and clean up our tainted food supply. So we've talked a little bit about that. And then
Mhm.
number two, to empower consumers to make more informed food choices. Well, that's where those apps come in, right? Yuka and GoCoco and EWG Verified, their product, those are the things that empower consumers to make more informed food choices. And that is a big part of what we are trying to get the word out there. Now, then and I think it's important for people on those apps, don't get hung up with, oh my goodness, that was a 42 and that was a 78, or that was an 8 or that was a 6. It's more, to me, progress. It's, again, feeling more empowered, feeling more understanding of, wow, these chemicals, I had no idea that that was a known carcinogen. I had no idea that it was a disruptor. I had no, and that's the point. And I always, all those statements, I love little sayings. It's just kind of how I motivate myself and others. And it's, the Vince Lombardi one, or whoever it really said, but perfection is the enemy of excellence, and so I don't view these apps as the be all end all. They're a start, but they
Mhm.
are better than not having it. And there's others like called Go Coco and others, and they use the Nova classification, which I know you know very well,
Mhm.
and things like that. And so they've got a different kind of science that looks at it. And EWG, Environmental Working Group, their app also has some scientists behind it, and they will disagree sometimes on the margins on certain things, but that's
Mhm.
okay. You know,
Yeah.
the important thing is that people are seeing that some of these products are a problem.
Yeah.
And
And
then,
calories matter too. I just want to mention, like, because the world of metabolic health and various conferences that, on food and everything, they kind of label ultra processed food as hyper palatable. Therefore, it leads to energy toxicity. Therefore, that's the root cause of the weight gain and the type 2 diabetes. And there's a lot of focus on calories, and not as much focus, because we're probably just not aware of it, as you're bringing to light, of the potential obesogens. And I know Dr. Robert Lustig, he has the book Metabolical, talks about these things that they're put into foods, and that as obesogens they can contribute to repartitioning into the fat compartment or to fatty liver in ways that are independent of calories. And I think that's like an important message. I think people in the general world of nutrition science don't fully appreciate and really understand at this point. So I think that's an important message, is that I think you do have that message that ultra processed food is, high fat, high sugar, salt, and that's hyper palatable. That leads to more calories, but it's also in the context of, which adds fuel to the fire, these other chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, that are mitochondrial toxins, that impact the endocrine system in a way that can give us everything from headaches to type 2 diabetes to hormonal changes. And I think we just don't know enough. So a lot of people avoid that discussion, but discussion needs to happen and more science needs to be done. But as you say, there's a lot of the science already.
Yeah. And to your point, I mean, we all know kind of just common sense that, 100 calories from broccoli is different than 100 calories from an Oreo. And so we all know there's a common sense element to that. All calories they cannot all be the same. And we know what empty calories are. People have understood that concept for a long time of how it does it. And that's part of the gimmickry of these foods, right? Is to make them, there's not as much water in them, so they're not as filling and they're easier to eat and they go faster and all those things. So it's, you alluded to this earlier, and we should talk briefly before we get into kind of the third leg of what we try to do, and that is the diabetes rate. So we have approximately a $5 trillion healthcare budget in the United States. It's close enough. About 10% of our country is now diabetic. So by definition, we are spending about $500 billion a year on diabetes in this country, just for diabetes. Forget about high blood pressure, cancer rates, et cetera, that we all believe flow from obesity rates. If you go to Europe, and if we could just aspirationally get to closer to where they are, meaning we would only have 1/3 of the diabetes rates that we have in this country, 1/3 or so of the obesity rates, we would save $350 billion a year just in diabetes alone, let alone that wouldn't need as many people on high blood pressure meds, wouldn't need all the other downstream things. And that's super important for people to realize because, we know how our government works, right? It funds health and it funds the military and now a lot of debt. I mean, so Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those are the big numbers in our budget. And the ability to do something about those would be incredible. And it is within our reach to do that if we can start thinking about it. And, another topic we talk a lot about is military readiness. Only 22% of young people can even apply for the military now. And I talk to people in the military all the time. They lower now the requirements even for basic training because they're not going to get enough people in. The recruiting classes are coming up short. The mess halls are now kind of almost like fast food mall outlets as opposed to the way it used to be. So they're getting more ultra processed food. So the recruits themselves are not as healthy. So we have this real, catch a falling knife thing going on where it's a military readiness issue too. So I always view these things as
related to that.
Yeah.
So it becomes a national security issue too. So I have been a reviewer on the Department of Defense Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, DoD CDMRP. And as a reviewer on grants on nutrition, dozens of grants that I've reviewed to tackle this very problem that, like, 40 years ago, they would have laughed about it. Like, it's basically reviewing government federally funded research to basically reduce obesity in military personnel so they could do their job, because they can't do their job because the majority of them are obese and overweight and they can't do the physical requirements necessary for them to do their job. So Congress literally allocated through the CDMRP program federal research and I mean, at the top of that very list should be ultra processed foods. And as you just mentioned, I mean, it's all over in the mess halls and, their food is, and most of those guys are drinking Red Bulls and Nature Valley granola bar, like they don't, there's not enough education. And I just came from a tactical nutrition conference in Norfolk, VA, and now the special operations community function like on a different level, right? But like the general population, this food comes from Natick. And it really needs to be part of the MREs. It needs to be part of the nutrition education within the military. And I think, I mean, you brought up something that's super important, and it becomes actually a national security issue. But yeah, changing the guidelines for guys that just like man the drones or whatever, do IT. So this discussion is sort of was even talked about at the at the meeting,
'Cause
but I think it's silly.
yeah, and I think part of what's happened is that the food industry, big food, has tried to make the conversation about that people are making bad choices and they're not exercising enough. And what I am saying is we believe that 80% of the fight is the food that's going into the body, and you
Absolutely.
can't exercise your way out of this stuff. And you know, you can overlay a chart from the 1980s to now when these synthetic chemicals started coming into our food supply and the obesity rates. As you well know, everybody kind of knows, you know, 60 years ago, we were not an overweight country. We didn't just get lazy. We have no fighting chance when you have a tainted, almost poisoned food supply that is gradually going to, for sure, shorten your health span, probably shorten your lifespan. This is the first time in history our life expectancy has gone down.
Mm-hmm.
And the health span is for sure going down. We are watching people that are 40s and 50s and struggling to get around because of what has been being put into their bodies. And yet they are being told it's their fault. And I would tell you it is not their fault. It is the fault of big food. It is the fault of these kinds of foods that are creating it. Now, of course, there is an issue at some point. If you're eating too much of anything, it's not a great thing. But there are so many people, I believe, in this country that want to make a better choice, but they don't know what that is. And that kind of ties into our third part of our solutions is not only on the website pointing to people, but how do we get better foods to them? So we do actually three other things in this final leg. We are developing a seal or an app that will reside on products. So for example, for the 70 whatever percent of the country who they are not going to Whole Foods, okay? They are not going to have the luxury of looking at different choices. Their shopping may occur at Dollar General or maybe Walmart or somewhere else. We want the ability to have a curated part of the store, be it an end cap, an aisle, or if it's digitally online, so that there are healthier food choices. So we know from EWG there are about 230,000 middle of the grocery store pantry items sold in the country. They've done the research and found that about 11% of those are defined as nutritious in the US and the UK standards, and 27% are not UPFs. So what does that mean? That means there's about 20,000 goods that are sold right now in grocery stores today in all the outlets that are healthier choices, but people don't know which ones they are. I've been with people even when I've been in DC talking to senators. There's one funny story. I was about to go in a senator's office and they had Cliff Bars on the outside. I'm not going to make any more comment, but the guy I was with was like, is that a healthy choice? You know, there's a guy climbing on the outside. It must be okay.
Yep.
That's the point, is people want to make healthier choices. I think a lot of people do. But how can you figure it out unless you're someone like you that can actually understand this stuff? And so what we want is that seal, be it the, you know, Good Housekeeping seal of approval, the EWG verified seal, the Food Fight USA seal, whatever it is that people will trust and know that is a healthier choice for me than others. And those exist today. We just have to identify them in those stores so that customers can have the option to do it, because they may not be scanning on an app, and this would be another methodology. So that's one thing we are working on, and we're in conversations with EWG on. Then on
Hey,
the
Todd,
other,
quick
yeah,
question. Will that go on? So we're talking about food, but I also think of sugar sweetened beverages, which have also some chemicals like, so is the vision to have the seal also on beverages in addition to food?
as
Yeah.
many places as
Yeah.
we can get
That's
it.
like liquid candy. And I mean, I think that's contributing to a big
Yep.
problem. Yeah, especially
And
with
as you
kids.
know, a lot of the apps, what's great about Yuka and Go Coco and some of them is they give alternatives. So they say, okay, maybe you
Yeah.
ought not have the full leaded Coke, but here's one that is a healthier choice. Not saying it's healthy, but it's healthier.
Right.
And to me, that's part of the battle here is let's at least just move over a little bit and allow people to have healthier choices. So yeah, I mean, nobody knows how that will play out. Will we be able to get seals on the goods? Will it have to be in the app itself that shows this is a green go? That we will sort out in the months ahead. But that's super important to me because that's the part of the country who has less optionality, and we need a solution to help them. We could spend an hour on SNAP, and we'll get to a little bit in regenerative farming, but that is a segment of the population that we need to make sure has better optionality than they have today. Then the other part, that's why I call it a little bit of a barbell, is to bring in foods. We're working with the leader in Demeter certified foods in Europe, a company called Campo Verde, to bring their pantry products into the US. Why? Because they, by definition, are regenerative farming, which we'll get to, I'm sure, in a couple of minutes. They are, by definition, doing all the things. And in Europe, they look at them as the gold standard, meaning you talk to somebody who's lucky enough to be able to buy from a health food store, and they will tell you, if you see the Demeter label, just buy it and eat it. Well, that's the dream, right? Is that people don't have to just sit and stare at the side of the label for 5 minutes and try and figure it out, but know that this is something healthier for them to eat. So we are going to be distributing a small amount out to friends, family, influencers, celebrities, probably over the holidays, to start seeding to see how people feel about having something, that's peanut butter, that's just peanuts. It's almond butter, it's just almonds.
Amazing concept.
There's a concept. And to show them that there are, and you can find some of these things in the States, but the point is you don't have to label shop. You just see the Demeter label and you already know that it's clean. So we will push both ends, right? Trying to get foods from that and that. And then the final part that we will do, because I think maybe in some ways the most important, is to try to make regenerative farming a bigger part of this country. And so you'll see in our mission statement, we say work with American farmers to grow healthier foods that work for them economically and benefit consumers' health. Because if we stay with conventional farming, we are going to be in a world of hurt very soon. We have lost, they estimate, maybe a third of our topsoil over the last 100 years. There's a lot of people who think in the next 50, 60 years, we might lose almost all of it. And why people should care about that is that really anybody who's in the industry, any farmer, any regenerative person, anybody that is in it knows the gold, the power is the nutrient-dense soil that creates the foods that we all want to eat, those strawberries that taste different and all of those things. And so one of the things I didn't realize till I got into this is 60% of the farmland in America is now farmed with basically products that are subsidized, corn, soy. Why? Because they get paid through the farm bill in order to do that. But only 2% of our farmland grows fruits and vegetables. So, I mean, we have a system that we have to get back into balance. And if that means over time that the farmers are incentivized differently, meaning if they get X amount per bushel if they grow it one way, then maybe they get a big premium if they grow it organic, or an even bigger premium if they grow
double
it
subsidy. Yeah. So double subsidy should go. We live on a farm, and I'm looking at the cows over in the pasture. It was row crop farm. They did strawberries and stuff, which is kind of a dirty, you use a lot of chemicals, but it was dirt. And then it's been about 3 or 4 years, 5 years, where the cows have been just doing their thing and letting the grass grow naturally. And now we actually have legitimate soil. Like, I do soil testing and I send it to University of Florida, and I look at the minerals, but I look at the organic matter and things like that. It takes time. Like, after 2 years, it was nothing. It was still dirt. But once the grasses start growing and the cows pooping on and peeing, and then, they're doing their
all the
thing.
composting.
And then, after 5 years, there's huge changes. And, and now it's, the land is fertile, and it took about 5 or 6 years of completely no chemicals. But it's very possible, and it was really amazing to watch that happen, like on our own property. But there's no subsidies, and there also needs to be logistics. There needs to be a system for small farmers to distribute their food in a way where it can get to centers where people can buy it. And I think I think people are working on different apps for that too. But
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, that's why in our mission statement, we don't just say it's got to be regenerative farming. We say it's got to make economic sense to the farmers because it has
Mhm.
to work for them. It can't just be, people don't work, they've got bills to pay, they've got rent to pay, they've got all sorts of things that matter to them. And we have to figure out a methodology that works for them in order to do that. And, so to that end, we are looking at, I went undergrad to Indiana University and then UVA for law school, and I'm looking at IU. We're having conversations to see if we can have some kind of regenerative farming summit in the Midwest at Bloomington, perhaps
Mhm.
in 2025, to bring together not just farmers, but venture capital and private equity and everyone who needs to be a part of this solution if we're going to get there. But I've had a couple people say it to me, and I think it's just super smart. It's like, it is so dire that we have to almost flip it completely on its head, meaning instead of it being conventional farming now and then a small percent is organic or something regenerative, it's got to almost be the opposite, where the vast, vast majority is
Yep.
regenerative and
Yep.
conventional farming is a smaller part of it. And that is going to be a massive undertaking. But that is, to me, the only way we eventually move this is to get healthier foods to people
Mhm.
than they have now. And that will be the most important thing we try to tackle. But it is gonna be a battle in order to do it.
That's a great place to have a meeting, right? In you got Purdue out there and you got like a couple big uh, just the breadbasket, like right in the center, the heartland of US. And I meant to mention, so food has an incredible impact on our mental health too. And I'm sort of part of this community of metabolic psychiatry. And I think basically that food is medicine, but also for your brain, even from, and I know you had suffered from migraines and things like that. It impacts brain energy metabolism, but neurotransmitter levels and things like that. And it impacts diseases like depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, like all these things are impacted by the food that we eat, the nutrition. So I'm working with different groups funding that. And Jan and David Bazuki have been funding, metabolic psychiatry, and they've also sort of are working in the periphery too on regenerative farming. So I think there's maybe some overlap there. And David Bazuki started Roblox, you might know, and I think everybody is working on different levels, but I see like a lot of synergy and collaboration that could potentially come out of this. Their main wheelhouse is metabolic psychiatry, but I know they're also working in the realm of regenerative farming.
And we try so much. I try to partner and work with as many people as we can because if we're going to have any chance, we have to all join together.
Yep.
It cannot be one group doing this and another group doing that because we need to be a united voice. And so that's why, again, like Dr. Hyman, like Dr. Van Tulleken, and Dr. Gupta, I mean, there's folks like that. I want to do whatever we need to
Mhm.
have them be a part of it and be part of the medical advisory group and help advise what we should do and move this forward because otherwise, you know, nothing will change and we have to try to create some change. And, as you know, the beauty of regenerative farming, having cover crops, crop rotation,
Yeah.
all the things that used to be how farming was. I'm from that part of the world. You grow up in
Mhm.
Indiana, farming is a big part of it. And so, yeah, for me, it was migraines. I have 8 to 10 migraines a month, back in the day, and it's because of the chemicals. And again, back to the Europe part of the story. And then I pieced together how much of it was attributed to what was in the food I was eating.
Mhm.
Now they are less. However, it is so difficult in the States to avoid them completely if you go to restaurants or you travel or you whatever. So it's a challenge here because it is so difficult to find clean food. Now, if you're lucky enough to be in one place or in an area that has those things, it's certainly an easier possibility. But for people, and there are a lot of Americans who travel and have to go
Mhm.
places for work or otherwise, it's difficult and it shouldn't be so difficult. And that's part of why we have to have this fight.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you following any kind of dietary protocol or avoiding? Did you find specific things or specific chemicals that were triggered for migraines? Because I get so many emails from people with migraine issues, and I know personally quite a few people with migraines. So curious about how you've approached managing that.
I think everybody is different, just like
Mhm.
a patient with any issue. I think people's migraines are different. Some people are triggered by certain things, others by others. Some have, as you know, the aura, some don't. Some get,
Mhm.
8 a month, some get one or two unbelievable ones, every month. And so it's different. For me, I had to give up caffeine. That was just a
Mhm.
non-starter. So I gave up caffeine years ago because that was for sure a trigger for me. That helped, but it didn't. It began the process, but it didn't fix the process. And so now I'm just super careful. And migraine sufferers will tell you, we look at every food and go, okay, is this going to trigger me? Is there something going on with this? And so we're very careful, or try to be, about what we put in because we know that might come back to haunt us later. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I try to eat as clean as I can, obviously real food whenever I can, try to avoid anything processed whenever I can.
Mhm.
And that has helped me for sure. But everybody's different, and migraine sufferers are for sure different. I do think, and a lot of people I think agree with this, a lot of sugar probably triggers migraines for people too.
For sure.
So I think
Mhm.
high levels of sugar are probably, and let's face it, it's not good for us in general.
Mhm.
And I do think sometimes that is a problem. And there's been a lot written about, that kind of migraine brain and how it is. But for me, those are the core things I do, and try to keep my electrolytes in balance if I can.
Mhm. Yep.
Because migraine sufferers, we like consistency. So when we travel or we get uneven sleep or we get all sorts of things, that's harder on us.
Yeah. Yeah. The use of ketogenic diets have, which is something that we study, and the ketones being sort of an energetic molecule and can stabilize. If your glucose is going up and down, the ketones kind of provide that steady flow of energy. So I know there's some clinical trials and a researcher, Dr. Alina Gross, who was a migraine sufferer, who has sort of published quite a bit on migraines and brain metabolism and impacting brain metabolism. So
Well, we'll have another conversation about that another day.
okay, yeah, I would love that. Well, I know we're coming up on time. Is there anything in particular anything else that you'd want to share? Besides, we'll
No,
have a lot of stuff in the show notes too here.
great. Yeah, no, this has been amazing. I'm glad we got to really talk about all of this.
Mhm.
And as I said at the top of this, all if people don't remember anything except that it's already happening elsewhere, and that there's no government agency regulating the food chemicals on the side of those packages, those are the things I care about the most, because that will upset people. And the rest of this, I hope people, garnered into certain things. There's, as you know, some amazing books out there on these topics to
Mhm.
really get people up to speed.
Yep.
And if anybody cares deeply about it, please go to Food Fight USA, sign up, be a warrior, get on the email list, participate, be a part of it. We need help. We need as many people as will do this if we're going to have any chance.
Mhm. All great information. And we know the scientific community general consensus is that ultra processed foods impact metabolic health, which is, tightly linked to heart disease, to Alzheimer's disease, and even cancer. So there's no mystery here. What is a mystery is why we're not taking action on these chemicals. And I'm so
Absolutely.
glad
And
that
you
you're
think
bringing it
about
to
it.
attention. Yeah.
Yeah. And, when you think about it, cigarettes, we always liken it to cigarettes because we do believe it's cigarettes for this generation. But at least
Mhm.
cigarettes, even at its height, 40% of the people say smoked. We all have to eat.
Yeah.
So this is
No
so
way
much,
around it.
yeah, there's no way around it. You can't just say, well, I won't eat. You have to eat. And so it's so pervasive. It's in everybody's system. And for us to naively think that all these chemicals are having no impact, they are.
Mhm. Yep. Well said. And thank you for kind of spearheading this movement. And there's really not too many, agencies that are taking on a similar um, aggressive approach, maybe because I mean, we talked about the corporate interests here, and I kind of, I can imagine that you might be attacked, but also you have like Schwarzenegger on your side. You have like some really big celebrities that are in your corner and helping you advance the education, the science of this, and I think
And,
the
and Mark's
legislation.
been great, right? Cuban's been
Mark,
great
yes, yeah,
helping in this. And, I've met with everyone from Commissioner Califf at the FDA to Secretary Vilsack, who oversees the USDA. I've been through the White House. I mean, we are letting them know. But what people need to understand is there's only a base level of understanding of these issues on the federal side. So
Mhm.
we all think, oh, they know it, they understand. They don't. And so
Yeah,
we have to try to educate them and get them to understand the severity of it because they're the ones, eating all the ultra processed foods on their desk.
yeah.
And that's the first step that we all need to do.
Yeah, and that's why, well, in the emails too, I think a scientific advisory board and then like a medical advisory board and having those two work together, because I think there's so much science that's already published, but I think that needs to be done on specific things like long-term studies and things like that. And I think that may produce, the tipping point to get legislation. And I think I love your approach from the top down to the bottom up with the grassroots. And I think that's the only way, you're going to get things accomplished. So,
Yeah, as we dove
yeah.
into this, right, it became obvious we had to come at it from a lot of different ways.
Mhm.
And if we just tried to do it legislatively, it would feel probably a little frustrating. And that's why, again, we adopted all these other things that we can at least move those needles and see what happens.
Mhm. Well, again, I thank you, and I'm in your corner. I'll be teaching this stuff and advocating to the USF Medical School, the medical students, and I think we have to educate our future doctors on this. And thank you for providing, the information on that. And yeah, I think there's a lot more to talk about. I had a lot of notes after just listening to your founder's speech, which I would tell everybody to go to Food Fight USA, click on the little bar founders speech, and it's a great, super dense, kind of concise summary of what the problem is. So again, Todd, thank you for joining us on Metabolic Link podcast, and I look forward to sharing this with
Perfect.
a lot
Thank
of
you so
people.
much. I
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for joining us on this episode. If you like this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues. Comment to let us know, or even better, leave us a review. The more you share the Metabolic Link, the further we can spread science on metabolic health and therapy. And if you'd like to listen to this episode and other exclusive content of this podcast without the ads, please check out our medical education platform. That's the Metabolic Initiative. This is built for medical professionals in mind, but it's open to the public. And the platform will not only provide you with private podcast episodes, but you get an incredible bank of presentation videos from our Metabolic Health Summit conference. So if you are not able to join that, you can see the content on there. We have many new lectures. We have world experts talking about a variety of topics. And we have the live Q&As from our thought leaders are also on there. And there's just so much more on that medical education platform, the Metabolic Initiative. So visit membership.metabolicinitiative.com to learn more about this content. And thanks again for tuning in. Hope to see you soon.
Do you love learning about metabolic health? So do we. It's why we created the Metabolic Initiative, an online educational platform providing evidence-based education on metabolic health and therapies for healthcare professionals and the general public. By joining the Metabolic Initiative, you'll gain access to hundreds of expert lectures, interviews, panel discussions, and even private episodes of the Metabolic Link. CMEs are available. Go to metabolicinitiative.com to get started. And as always, thank you for listening to the Metabolic Link.